Matthew 7 and verse 12 is about where we left off, as Christ is talking about how that we are to seek and to ask, to knock, and God will always provide for those who are seeking, asking, and knocking. He will open the door. He will always be there to bless His people. Those who seek to do His will, those who are requesting from Him, He will always bless them. Certainly in the spiritual realm, His faithful children, He will always forgive as they repent and confess and walk in the light. John chapter 1 talks about. And also in the physical realm will be given blessings. He compares that to an earthly parent or an earthly father who would give bread to a son who would ask. He would not give a stone. He would give a fish to a son who would ask. He would not give a serpent. Verse 9 and 10. He says in verse 11, "If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask Him?" Now notice that. Give good things to those who ask Him. We must understand that something that we are asking of God must be good, and it must be according to the Lord's will. I don't think the Lord intends for us to ask Him to hit it big when we go play the casinos. That's not a good thing. Or, be with my relative, my female relative who is about to go get an abortion. Be with them and bless them in the abortion. That's not a good thing. That's murder of an unborn child. So it has to be a good thing that we are requesting from the Lord. And He's saying, if you're being evil, if you're an evil parent, you're imperfect, yet you know how to give good things to your children, how much more will the perfect parent, God the Father, who knows all things and knows what we need before we even ask Him, will be able to give good things to His children. So He's going to bless His people and provide for them. And we must always look to God as we are children, looking to Him as our guide, as our Father, that He's always going to provide what is best for us. He knows what's best for us better than we do, and He is going to provide for His people. He always has, and He always will. And so we have to have that attitude of complete reliance upon Him. Now, we have to understand what is good. And the only way we can understand what is good is to find it revealed in the Scripture. What is good according to God's will, not according to our own standard. So we must ask of Him, and He will provide. He is a God who pities His children. Psalm 103 is a beautiful psalm in which the psalm writer, by inspiration, talks about, as a father pities his children, so God pities His own people. Those who fear Him, those who keep His commandments, those who keep His covenant. So there is a condition involved there. But you think of the ultimate parent, God, wanting the best for His children. And when we have that view and that outlook of God, we will not go to the extreme and think that God is just waiting for us to sin so He can throw us into hell. And that He gets some sort of morbid pleasure out of seeing people lost and burned. That's not how it is. Now, He will punish those who rebel against Him. They will be lost. And that is an outgrowth of His love, believe it or not. That is an outgrowth of love, true love. But He does not want that. He wants the best for His children, and He has provided the way. And He says, if you follow this, you will be blessed. We'll have all spiritual blessings in Christ, Ephesians 1 and verse 3. And we partake of all those spiritual blessings when we seek His will, ask, and we knock. And those who are seeking to do the will of God, they'll find the way and they'll find the truth. Verse 12, he says, therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. This has been called the golden rule. But what does that mean that this is the law and prophets? Verse 12. What does that mean? Right, God does not lie. That sums up our action, right. Therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, you do to them. And he's saying this is the summation of the law and the prophets. What does the law and prophets represent in Hebrew thought? That's the whole Old Testament. We have it broken down into 39 books in our English Bibles. And so the law and the prophets, that represents the two major divisions of the Old Testament, and it represents all of it. He's saying all of the Old Testament is summed up in you doing to others as you would have people do to you. And of course, that law carries over into the New Testament, that we do to others as we would have them do to you. And think of how that would improve relationships if we carried that out. As a husband to a wife, or a wife to a husband, or children to parents, or in the workplace, or in society. You want somebody to be nice and kind to you, you be nice and kind to them. You want people to help you in a situation that you're struggling with, you be willing to help others. If you want someone to love you enough to correct you or to tell you when you're going astray, you do the same. So it's that you do unto others as you would have them do unto them. And that's the summation of the law and the prophets. How we treat others has a lot to do with our relationship with God. We cannot say we have a right relationship with God and treat others with contempt in an unloving, unkind manner. We can't do that because love your neighbor as yourself. You love God supremely, then you love your neighbor as yourself. In fact, that commandment was found in the book of Leviticus, or in the Old Law. So that was a concept. You love your neighbor as yourself. You do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's a summation of the law and the prophets. And oftentimes you'll find this as the golden rule on posters in schools. And you know how you're not supposed to have religion in schools. Some of them may not even realize that that's from the words of Christ. They knew that, the ACLU would be all over them. Separation of church and state, you know. That whole misconception. But anyway, that's where it came from. What you want people to do to you, you do to them. Verse 12 in the New American Standard reads this way. In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. For this is the law and the prophets. If you would want someone to teach you the gospel, if you were lost, go and teach the gospel. Aren't you glad someone loved you enough to teach the gospel to you? Aren't we grateful that someone took the time to teach us and evangelize us and show us the way, and those Bible teachers that taught us when we were young, and the preachers that we know of that helped develop our minds? Then we are to go and do likewise, go and try to evangelize and take this gospel to the world. It falls into every facet of our life, that we are to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Verse 13 and 14. From verse 13 on through verse 27, Jesus is wrapping up the Sermon on the Mount. And He's basically talking about two ways. One way leads to salvation and life. The other way leads to destruction and eternal condemnation. Those two ways are going to be contrasted with different language throughout the rest of the sermon. He says in verse 13, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Luke chapter 13 and verse 24. Luke chapter 13. Jesus was asked a question in verse 23. He was asked, Lord, are there just a few who are being saved? And He said to them, verse 24, Luke 13, strive to enter through the narrow door, for many, I tell you, will seek to enter and will not be able. So you have here Christ telling them, you got to strive. You've got to put every effort into it. You've got to want it so bad that you will give your life for it. And that doesn't just mean dying. It could mean that. But it means you're willing to make a total commitment to it. You've got to strive. Just like the word is used to describe an athlete. An athlete who is training to be in the Olympic Games has to be totally and completely devoted to their training, or they're not going to make it. And that's the same word that's used to describe the Christian who's got to be totally and completely committed, or they're not going to make it. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying here. As He says in verse 13 and 14, reading from the New American Standard, He says, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction. And many who enter through it. And there are many who enter through it, verse 14. For the gate is small and the way is narrow, some translations say difficult, that leads to life, and there are few who find it. So not only is Christ contrasting the two ways in life, the narrow way that leads to life and the broad way that leads to destruction, He's also contrasting the many with the few. Many, Jesus is making it very clear, are going to go down that broad way that is a way that leads to destruction. It leads to hell. It leads to eternal condemnation. There are many who go in through it. Why? Verse 14, because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way that leads to life. Do you know Christ made it very clear that it's difficult to live the Christian life? The word narrow there, in talking about the way that leads to life, the gate is small and the way is narrow, some translations say, is referring to a area that's hard to maneuver in. It's very narrow. In other words, it's like a very narrow bridge. There's no room of going one way or the other, or you'll fall off the edge. That's what He's talking about. And it's a difficult way because it takes calculated steps to walk across this bridge, because you've got to be observing where you're going, making sure your footsteps are where they're supposed to be, or you're going to go off the edge. Now, we're not saying it's impossible to go to heaven, but we're just saying what Jesus said, it's difficult. You know why some aren't going to go in the church? It's difficult. They don't want to live that life that is narrow, that life that is a life that calls for discipline. That's what it means to be a disciple of Christ, to be disciplined. And Jesus said, few there be that find it. They're not willing to repent. They're not willing to walk the way that Christ wants them to walk. It's easy to go down the road of destruction that leads to hell. It's the easy, it's the broad way. When you have an area that's broad, you can go all over the place on that broad road. It doesn't take much effort to go down a broad road. You don't have to watch where you're going. It's no problem. But that narrow way that leads to life, you have to watch where you're going. You have to step your feet on that path precisely, and you have to walk in a way that's calculated, and you're observing where you're going, and you don't have room to say, well, I'm going to go over here to the right. You don't have that option. You don't have that room to go over here to the left. And yes. Yes, when you obey the gospel and you become a Christian and you're following that path, you're doing the will of the Word of God and following His will, and His Word is what leads us down that path. And so we have to be willing to follow His instructions and go down that path that leads to life. How many is a few? 3 or more? A few in the days of Noah were how many? 8. Jesus is making it very clear that those who are going to heaven are in the minority. Few. Now, in our society, we don't like to think of that, so we try to broaden it out and to think about, well, maybe everyone who believes in Jesus is going to go to heaven. We're going to find out later on in the chapter that's not even true. So some people are universalists. They believe that everyone's going to heaven. Hitler, Saddam Hussein, they're going to heaven. Yeah, they were bad people, but God's so gracious, He can't punish His creation. Therefore, everyone's going to heaven. That's a universalist. Well, of course, that contradicts the plain teaching here. And so people don't like this narrow thinking. In fact, in talking to people in the past, members of the church who are now broad in their thinking, they say, Shawn, I used to think like you, but that was just so narrow. And immediately I thought of this verse. Narrow is the way that leads to life. And I think I even cited it to the person, and he didn't have much to say about that. It is a narrow way. To say that there is only one true church, and you have to be in that church to be saved, that's narrow. There's a sermon that I will never forget. I heard it on the Truth and Love years ago when I was a teenager. I forgot the gentleman's name, but he preached an excellent lesson in which it was called The Narrowness of God. In which he went through the Bible from Noah all the way through and talked about how God is very specific and He wants His instructions to be followed specifically and precisely, and it's very narrow, and if you deviate from it, then you will not receive the blessing that He has intended you to have. Called the narrowness of God. Of course, he brought it all the way up into the fact that there is but only one true church. But that goes against our society's thinking of pluralism. You've got to have plural thinking. You've got to have this attitude of we can't say one religion is better than the other. We've got to give equal time to the Buddhist, the Hindu, the Muslim. We don't want to offend anybody. And pretty soon, I guess you're going to have to give equal time to the Satanist and everyone else. If not, why not? They're a religion. They worship Satan. So it's that pluralistic attitude that is contrary to the will of God. Christianity, pure Christianity, is by its very definition narrow and exclusive. Truth, by its very definition, is narrow and exclusive. And people don't like that. It's inclusive of everyone who wants to do the will of God, but excludes everyone else who doesn't. And we have to understand that if we're going to do the will of God. And he says many are going to go the way that's broad in its thinking, that's broad in its philosophy. It's the broad way that leads to destruction. Verse 14, because narrow is the gate and difficult is the way that leads to life, and there are few who find it. So we have to understand that there is a contrast here between the many and the few. I don't think it's a coincidence that he directly goes into talking about false prophets right after that. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think he is following through with the thought of this broad way that leads to destruction. These false prophets are going to try to get you to go down that way. Verse 15, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear good fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Verse 19, every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. So immediately he starts talking about in verse 15, beware of false prophets. Well, to the listening audience, they would know exactly what he's talking about being Jewish, because they knew in their history there were false prophets. There were many in the days of Israel's history of people who claimed to be prophets and lied and deceived the people. There was one false prophet during the days of Jeremiah who was telling the people everything's okay, don't worry about the Babylonians, everything's wonderful. Don't listen to Jeremiah, he's narrow. Don't listen to his negative preaching. Everything's great, we have the temple here. You're not going to go into captivity. But he was lying to the people. But most of the people listened to him because that was a message they wanted to hear. They didn't want to hear Jeremiah's message that said, you need to repent. You've got to change your ways or God is going to take the Babylonians, use them as His instrument, and bring judgment on this nation. They didn't want to hear that. That means they had to change their ways and acknowledge they were wrong. So those false prophets were the ones who gained an audience, and Jeremiah was left for dead. Of course, it turned out that Jeremiah was correct. God was speaking through him. So they were very familiar with the concept of a false prophet. That if someone spoke, and it's even stated in the book of Deuteronomy, that if a prophet speaks and it's not according to the will of God, if the thing they speak doesn't come true, you're to take that false prophet out and kill him under the law of Moses. He's to be put to death. So they were very familiar with the concept of false prophets, but in the New Testament, under the New Covenant, there was going to be those who would be false prophets. They are those who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. They're dangerous. They look like sheep. They look like good Christians. They look like followers of Christ, but they are not. And they don't have a name tag or a t-shirt that says, I am a false prophet. Did you know that every false prophet never thinks they're a false prophet? There's not one false prophet that thinks, you know what, I'm a false prophet. They think they are speaking for God, and they believe that they are doing the will of God. They're so deluded. You think of all of them down through history. Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saints Church. You think of Muhammad, the founder of Islam. You think of all those down through the ages who claim to be a prophet of God. They don't think, well, you know, I'm a false prophet. I'm going to lead people down a road to destruction here. No, they think they're deluded, and that's why 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 speaks of God sending them a strong delusion because they don't take pleasure in the truth. They're deluded into thinking that God is speaking to them. They're false prophets. And he says, verse 16, you will know them by their fruits. You will know them by what they produce. What does that mean? You will know them by their fruits. Right. You can know a person is a false teacher or a false prophet by what they produce, what they say, what they practice. And that involves correct judging. He says in chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, he talks about, or verses 1 through 5, he talks about false judging or judging incorrectly, hypocritical judging that's not supposed to be done. But like I heard one preacher say one time, well, if you don't like the concept of judging, then you could just say you're a fruit inspector. You're a fruit inspector. I'm just inspecting the fruit. And I tell you what, when you inspect the fruit of people and they teach, you ask questions, they don't like it. That ravenous wolf comes out. They don't like to be questioned in what they do. You'll know them by what they produce and what they do. And he says, do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? The answer is no. He talks about a good tree and a bad tree, that a good tree bears good fruit and a bad tree bears bad fruit. You know what kind of tree or what kind of fruit tree a tree is when you go and you see the fruit on it, and you can know whether that tree is diseased or not. by the fruit it produces. And he says a tree, every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Verse 19. What's that fire reference to? Hell. This is one of the numerous references that Christ gives to the place called hell. If a tree does not produce good fruit, you think of that as a congregation or an individual Christian, they're not producing good fruit, they're going to be cut down and they're going to be thrown into the fire. Verse 20, therefore by their fruits you will know them. That's the second time he said that. Look at verse 16. You will know them by their fruits. Verse 20, therefore by their fruits you will know them. Why is something repeated? Emphasis. You will know them by what they produce. You can see what they do. And that's the only thing we can judge. Words that come out of a person's mouth and their actions. I can't judge motives. I can't judge what's in a person's heart. Only Christ can do that. But we can judge actions and we can judge words. And you're to inspect them. That's why John says in 1 John 1 and 1 John 4 and verse 1, Beloved, believe not every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they be of God. You put them to the test, and this is the standard. You put them to the test. I should be inspected and tested every time I speak to make sure I'm preaching the truth. So we have to do that and not be concerned about, well, he's so nice. He smiles so pretty. He's got such a great personality. Is he preaching the truth? Is he preaching the truth? Some people get carried away by personalities and by things of that nature, and they forget that the truth is not being taught. We have to always be willing to inspect the fruit. Verses 21 through 23. Any questions about that or comments about that? Right. Most of the epistles that were written to correct problems, to help correct problems. You think of 1 and 2 Corinthians. Paul wrote to the church at Corinth to help correct all the problems they had. They were abusing the Lord's Supper. They were jealous over one another concerning spiritual gifts. They were enamored with brother so-and-so preacher and dividing over the preachers. And he wrote them by inspiration to correct those problems. And then in 2 Corinthians, he writes to defend his apostleship and to answer critics who were criticizing him. So he wrote to answer those critics. And so they were written to correct problems. And you have to be able to know what a problem is before you can help the situation. So that's a good point. Galatians 5:22, the fruit, in a sense, yes, because the fruit of the Spirit there, let me turn over there. The fruit of the Spirit is how you respond to the will of God. The will of God is described as seed. We have to receive with meekness God's Word into our heart, and we produce what God wants us to produce in our life by how we live. I follow what you're saying because of some people who say, by their fruits you shall know them. And look at Galatians 5 and verse 22. We've studied this as far as the aspect of each one of these in detail. But someone will say, well, I know this person and they don't teach that baptism is necessary for salvation. But look, they have love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control in their life. Therefore, they must be producing the fruit of the Spirit. But one thing is key here. Look at verse 22. Faithfulness. That means faithfulness to God's Word. And if a person has all these other qualities and they don't have faithfulness to God's Word, they're not producing the fruit of the Spirit. So you might find someone that's a false teacher and they seem so loving and joyful and peaceful and patient and kind and good. They're gentle and they're self-controlled, but they're not faithful. They're not faithful to God's Word. They're not really producing the fruit of the Spirit. That's wrong. You're not producing the fruit of the Spirit. Right. The whole package. The whole thing. They all have to go together or they fall. Now, right. They all go together. So you have all these things together, and if a person comes across someone, and you can find people in the denominational world. Let's just take it out of the denominational realm. You can find a Muslim that's loving, joyful, peaceful, kind, good, gentle. They have self-control, but they don't even believe Jesus is the Son of God. You can't say they're faithful. So it all goes together. So that faithfulness is very important. When someone points out, well, this person you say this person is a false teacher, but they're producing the fruit of the Spirit. Well, let's see if they are. Let's take their fruit of what they teach and compare it with the standard, God's Word, and inspect that fruit and see if they are faithful. Okay, they're teaching the sinner's prayer way of salvation. They're not producing the fruit of the Spirit, you see. They're not faithful, yes. Honesty. Faithfulness, honesty, being honest. And that brings it even closer. Is a person being honest with God's Word. Faithfulness and honesty, they go together. Is a person being faithful and honest to God's Word? Are they being honest when they teach the truth? And so that honesty, that faithfulness to God's Word has to be there. And when it's shown that it's not, then you're showing that they're not really producing the fruit of the Spirit. Because when a person has all of these nice qualities, and they say, you don't have to be baptized to be saved, when Jesus said you do, they're lying. Now, they might be as sincere as can be, but they're still lying. And especially when you show them the passages, okay, Jesus said this concerning baptism, and the New Testament says this, and they reject it, and they still continue to teach that. We can't say they're honest with God's Word. Are faithful. Yes. Right. Exactly. That's another good point. Heresy there. What verse is that? 20. Idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, outburst of anger, disputers, dissension, factions, or heresies. Those who are part of factions. Well, denominationalism is factions. And strife. Those who stir up strife. That's part of the work of the flesh. There are those who stir up strife in a congregation by the things that they say. And so that's part of the work of the flesh. And division and outburst of anger. They're not in control of their emotions. And things of that nature as far as the flesh. And that factions there is part of it. They cause a faction or a religious group. Well, if a congregation is not the Lord's church, it's a denomination, then it's not a part of what it's supposed to be. So again, that's a real good point. A faction has to be based upon a false teaching. If it were not, it would be the Lord's church. So, yes. You have all of what now? I'm sorry. Exactly. Right. Exactly. But that doesn't mean you're perfect. Nobody is. So when a person says, well, you can't inspect my fruit because you're not perfect, therefore we couldn't judge anything. And it's very interesting how people confuse boldness with rudeness. And it's not the same thing. Right. Exactly. Looking at ourselves, we've got to make sure that we're producing the fruit of the Spirit, and also looking at others' fruit. But it doesn't matter how kind you do it. Some people don't want it done. They didn't in the days of Jesus. The perfect fruit inspector was killed because he would not back down. So, we will continue our discussion, good discussion on this, and we will continue this later on.